They say the walls of the Hartwell mansion still remember the whispers, that if you stand in the master bedroom after midnight and look into the east-facing mirror, something will look back at you that is not your reflection. Not quite. This is not superstition. This is not a fireside ghost story. This is the kind of truth that men in power have buried beneath polite history because it makes their skin crawl, and because it reveals just how fragile the human mind can be when the right levers are pulled. Jeremiah Hartwell was no ordinary man. He didn't just rise in the early industrial age. He climbed like a predator, step by step, over the necks of rivals until he stood alone at the top. He built his empire on iron and steel, but his true work was more private, more deliberate, and far darker. Over the course of 25 years, 4 wives entered his Beacon Hill estate in Pennsylvania, women of intelligence, beauty, and impeccable social standing, and every single one of them left that house in the same way, broken, babbling, eyes darting to invisible companions in the glass. The town whispered of family curses. Physicians called it nervous exhaustion. The clergy muttered about the dangers of female ambition. But the truth no one dared speak aloud, was that this wasn't chance, it wasn't fate, and it wasn't madness in the way the public understood it. Each wife's collapse was orchestrated, not with poison in a glass, nor with bruises that could be seen, but with something far more precise, the steady rewiring of the mind carried out in a room designed for exactly that purpose, a room soaked in intention, where every detail, the wallpaper, the light, the mirrors, was placed not for beauty, but for control. By the time authorities uncovered fragments of the plan in 1835, it was already too late for the first 3 women. The methods Hartwell used would later be whispered about in medical circles as a mirror-based cognitive fracture technique, a form of psychological conditioning that attacked identity itself. The Hartwell mansion was not simply a home, it was a theater, and Jeremiah Hartwell was both architect and stage director. Every corridor, every shadow, every surface was chosen to manipulate perception. Visitors marveled at the imported French wallpaper, the mahogany furniture, and the marble fireplaces, but they never asked why the master bedroom's mirrors were arranged in such a deliberate geometry. Most people, when they see a mirror, think only of reflection. Hartwell understood something deeper, something that philosophers in ancient Greece and secretive monastic orders in Europe had hinted at for centuries. The human mind is never truly still when looking at its own image. The brain begins to question, to compare, to divide self from image. And if you know how to guide that fracture, you can pull a person apart without leaving a single mark. Margaret Dunlap, Hartwell's first wife, never realized the trap until she was too far inside it. She thought she was moving freely through her new life, managing household affairs, entertaining guests, fulfilling her role. But in the master bedroom, the light struck the glass at angles that distorted subtly, imperceptibly. The long mirrors near the bed curved her silhouette. The vanity reflected her eyes in ways that made them seem too wide, too tired, too other. Hartwell encouraged her to spend more time there. "It's important," he told her, "for a lady to know herself deeply." Sometimes, when she caught her own gaze in the mirror, she thought she saw a flicker of movement in the corner, but it wasn't in the room, it was in the glass. Weeks turned into months, and Margaret began to speak of the other one. She said the reflection was speaking to her, telling her things about the house, about Jeremiah, about the women who had lived there before her. The strange part was, there weren't any. Margaret was the fiancée, or Mrs. Hartwell, or so she believed. Within a year, her thoughts no longer belonged entirely to her. Hartwell's design, the angles, the lighting, the reflective placement, had been enough to pry open the space between identity and image. Once that split existed, he could fill it with whatever reality he wanted, and that, more than any locked room or hidden poison, was the real prison. Elena Rodriguez never feared mirrors. In fact, she adored them. When she married Jeremiah Hartwell in 1834, she found the master bedroom's vast array of polished glass to be a mark of sophistication, proof that she had ascended into a life worthy of admiration. At first, she used them as any proud young wife would, to adjust her hair, to check her gown before greeting guests. But Hartwell had already made his subtle modifications. The geometry was different now, the angles tighter, the mirrors placed so that her eyes were always just slightly higher in the reflection than in reality, a trick that made her subconscious feel she was looking up to herself, as if the woman in the glass were older, wiser, and perhaps in charge. The conversations began innocently enough. She would sit at her vanity and murmur thoughts aloud, not to herself, but to the reflection. When her maid, Maria, asked about it, Elena only smiled. "She's advising me," she said, "on how to run the house. She knows so much." Maria kept her concerns to herself. She had heard whispers from the older staff about the previous Mrs. Hartwell, but she had also heard Jeremiah's warning. "Speak of her, and you will be dismissed without pay." By the third month, Elena's advisor, in the mirror, began revealing strange details. The name of a stonemason who had supposedly built a hidden chamber in the east wing, the location of a letter sewn into the lining of a drapery, the claim that the woman who came before her, a woman named Margaret, was still inside the house, trapped in the glass. Jeremiah never contradicted these ideas. In fact, he encouraged her to listen closely and write down anything important she says. He told her it was for a book he might one day write about the psychology of women. What Elena didn't see, what she could never have seen, was how precisely her sense of reality was bayed. Nang shifted. The mirrors were not random. They were tools. The light from the eastern window was adjusted with curtains so that certain times of day made her reflection's lips appear to move slightly when she wasn't. By April of 1835, she no longer needed Maria's company during the day. She preferred to be alone in the master bedroom, where the air felt thick, the glass gleamed like water, and the woman in the mirror never, ever stopped watching. And still, the town saw nothing. To them, she was the perfect wife in the perfect marriage. By the summer of 1835, Elena's reflection was no longer just a silent companion. It was a presence with demands. She began rearranging the bedroom according to its suggestions. The bed was shifted so the moonlight would fall directly across the largest mirror at night. Smaller pieces of polished silver were placed in corners where they could catch her peripheral vision. The wallpaper pattern, delicate vines curling into spirals, seemed to writhe when viewed through the glass, a movement she claimed helped her understand the messages better. Hartwell observed all of this without interference. In fact, he documented it meticulously in a leather-bound journal, page after page of notes on the speed of her transformation, her level of compliance, her shifts in tone when speaking to the other woman. It wasn't madness in the random, chaotic sense. It was a guided descent, a dismantling of Elena's identity piece by piece, until she deferred to her reflection as the authority on everything from meal preparation to which guests should be invited. By now, Elena's maid, Maria, was terrified. She overheard Elena asking the mirror about events that hadn't happened yet and receiving answers. Sometimes those answers were right. A storm predicted, a letter arriving from a cousin, even the sudden death of a merchant in Pittsburgh. Maria, a devout Catholic, began crossing herself each time she entered the master bedroom. She tried to warn Elena's father in a letter, but it never reached him, intercepted, Maria suspected, by Hartwell himself. Elena's behavior in public remained flawless. At dinner parties, She was charming, articulate, even radiant. Guests would leave commenting on how fortunate Jeremiah was to have found such a capable wife. But when the guests were gone and the lamps were turned low, she returned to her post before the mirror, waiting like a disciple's. E for revelation. The mirror had told her there was something behind the walls of the master bedroom. Not treasure, not a hidden room, something alive. And here is where I need you, watching this now, to remember this moment. Because once you begin seeing patterns where others see coincidence, you can't go back. The mind changes. You change. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the heavy, oppressive kind that suffocates the air and makes your skin prickle. The villagers began to whisper, not in the way people share gossip, but in the way people speak of storms and sicknesses, as if their very words might invite misfortune. Those who passed the Caraway home claimed they could hear voices at night, soft, rhythmic murmurs that sounded too deliberate to be prayer, too urgent to be conversation. One farmer swore he saw candlelight moving in the upstairs window long past midnight, shadows twisting in ways that suggested more than one figure was inside, though both sisters had been seen standing together in the front yard minutes earlier. Another villager, a widow whose child had died under the Caraway's care, claimed that when she awoke one night, she found a sprig of blackthorn wedged into her doorframe, the scent of herbs and rot clinging to it. She burned it before dawn, but the smell lingered for days. The rumors began to evolve into something darker, something more dangerous. Some said the sisters were not midwives at all, but gatekeepers of life and death, that they could choose who entered this world and who did not, that they were keeping count, but not of births. Others swore that the Caraways never truly buried their dead, that the stillborn infants were taken elsewhere, perhaps for rituals whispered about in old, half-forgotten tales. A few brave, or perhaps foolish men claimed they would confront the sisters, demand answers, and put an end to the whispers. None of them followed through. One man who tried returned home pale and trembling, muttering incoherently about eyes that looked straight through him and a smiling silence that froze him in place. By the time the first frost came that year, the air around the Caraway home had changed. It felt colder, heavier, as if the house itself. Elf had decided to keep secrets, and the sisters, they were seen less and less in daylight, but more often at night, moving along the edge of the woods with bundles in their arms, their faces hidden beneath heavy hoods. No one followed them, not because they didn't want answers, but because they feared they might actually find them. By the autumn of 1872, the Thornwell estate was a place no sane man would enter after sundown. Yet it never stood empty. Servants came and went, each leaving within days, often without collecting their wages, muttering of voices behind locked doors and the sickly sweet smell of rot that drifted through the halls. But the family never left. The Thornwells lived in a strange half-existence, as though the house itself kept them tethered. Windows were nailed shut from the inside, curtains drawn permanently. The front door was always locked, yet somehow visitors, invited or not, found themselves ushered in, only to be swallowed by its corridors. Whispers began that the Thornwells were keeping company no one else could see. Neighbors swore they caught glimpses through the lace curtains, shadowed figures seated at the long dining table, unmoving, while the family ate in silence. The guests never spoke, never blinked, and never seemed to leave. But the most unsettling tales came from the few who made it out alive. They described rooms where the air was so cold frost bloomed on the wallpaper, portraits whose painted eyes followed them, and the constant sense, suffocating, electric, that someone was standing just behind them, breathing against their ear. One young maid, pale as death when she returned home, claimed she had been ordered to serve tea to Aunt Margaret. Only Aunt Margaret had been buried for 23 years. By winter, the house developed its own strange heartbeat. Footsteps could be heard pacing in empty rooms, doors opened and closed without touch, and the faint sound of a spoon stirring china echoed from the dining room, even when the table was bare. It was no longer just a place the Thornwells inhabited. It was a living, breathing thing, and it seemed to be growing hungrier. The air in the attic seemed to close in on Mary as the flickering lamplight revealed the thing she had overlooked, a small wooden chest wedged between the rotting beams and a stack of moth-eaten quilts. It was no bigger than a bread box, but its lid was bound shut with what looked like braided human hair, brittle and dust-covered. A lock, tarnished to a sickly green, clung to the latch. She hesitated before touching it. The air grew colder, and from somewhere deep within the house, a faint sound rose, a slow, rhythmic tapping like a fingernail against wood. The sound seemed to answer her movements, growing louder as she approached the chest. For a moment, she thought she could hear it whisper her name. Her fingers trembled as they brushed the lock, the cold metal biting into her skin. It wasn't the chill that made her pull back. It was the sensation, a strange vibration, as though the lock had a heartbeat of its own. She fetched a rusted nail from the floor, slid it into the keyhole, and with a hesitant twist, the lock gave way with a sound too wet to be mechanical. The braided hair fell loose in her hands, brittle strands snapping under her touch. As she lifted the lid, the lamp guttered violently, casting wild shadows across the attic. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in faded muslin, stained with irregular, rust-colored blotches. When she unwrapped it, her breath caught. Within was a porcelain doll, its face cracked, but its glass eyes intact. The eyes were wrong, too real, glistening faintly in the lamplight, and she could swear they followed her every movement. She set the doll on the attic floor, its porcelain face catching the dim light like a pale moon. For a moment, she thought it was merely an old toy, forgotten and harmless. But then came the sound, a faint, deliberate tap, like fingernails on wood. It didn't come from the floorboards beneath her, but from within the doll itself. Her breath grew shallow as she leaned closer, the air thick with the scent of damp cloth and something faintly metallic. The doll's lips, painted in a chipped red, seemed to twitch. She blinked hard, telling herself it was only her imagination, yet the movement came again, sharper this time, as though forming a word she could not hear. The attic air felt suddenly heavier, as though every shadow had turned its gaze toward her. Then, from somewhere deep inside the doll, there came a low, rhythmic hum, human, almost like a lullaby, but sung in a voice that did not belong in this house.